Good morning, everyone. This is Brad Berzer for American Heritage. I am recording this on April 9th of 2020. That's a Thursday, but I'm recording this for April 10th, Good Friday. And hope you guys are all doing well. And as always, please know that I really miss you. So we're going to keep talking with what we had been talking about with the idea of ideology and progressivism. And we're going to skip around just a little bit in your book. And I apologize for that. I probably should have given you a little fair warning, but some of these things we're going to do today, I actually did not want you reading beforehand. You're welcome to have if you did. It's not a problem, but I kind of wanted to go over them together. So the first thing I want to do is, as we're discussing this power of ideology that develops in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, 1900s, 19-teens, as we're looking at this rise of ideology, I'd like us to think about how prevalent it becomes. So please turn to page 735 in your reader to that piece we have by Walter Lippmann called The Dominant Dogma of the Age. And he tells us, this is at the bottom of 735, 1938, in the violent conflicts which now trouble the earth, the active contenders believe that since the struggle is so deadly, it must be that the issues which divide them are deep. I think they're mistaken, because parties are bitterly opposed. It does not necessarily follow that they have radically different purposes, right? We can see that. They could be flip sides of the same coin, really two different ways of trying to approach a certain topic, very, very closely related to one another, maybe 90 to 95% overlap of their goals, their motives, their desires, and yet what do they fight about? They fight about that tiny little difference between them. And I think we can see here that there is very, very little difference between, say, the socialism of Hitler and the socialism of Lenin. They both have almost everything in common. They're both totalitarianisms, but they go by different names and they have a few different premises. And they fight like mad with one another, even though they really are very similar one to another. So it does not necessarily follow that they have radically different purposes. The intensity of their antagonism is no measure of the divergence of their views. There have been many a ferocious quarrel among sectarians who worship the same God. And how well do we know that throughout our history of religion? Right? They worship the same God, but they're sectarians. Same thing is true with fascists and with communists. Although the partisans who are now fighting for the mastery of the modern world wear shirts of different colors, and this was actually the norm at the time, not just shirts, but scarves that they would wear, the different kinds of things to indicate what political party they belonged to. In Germany, for example, if you wore brown, you were a Nazi. If you wore black, you were a conservative. If you wore blue, you were a liberal. And if you wore red, you were a communist. Pink, a socialist. So there were variations and gradations here. And you can imagine, this is somewhat really offensive when you think about, all right, how do we know somebody? Well, look at the color that they're wearing, and now we can judge what their politics are. And yet that was actually the case in the 1930s. So let me repeat that. Although the partisans who are now fighting for the mastery of the modern world wear shirts of different colors, their weapons are drawn from the same armory, their doctrines are variations of the same theme, and they go forth to battle singing the same tune with slightly different words. Their weapons are the coercive direction of life and labor of mankind. Right? This is what they want. They want power over the state to determine all aspects of life, to crush individuality, and to crush group association, and to create only one community, the community around their ideology. Nothing more than that, certainly no layers. And this, of course, should be, for all of you, very similar in the mind. This should remind you of the French Revolution. Their doctrine is that the disorder and misery can only be overcome by more and more compulsory organization. Their promise is that through the power of the state, Men can be made happy. So not just through the power of the state, but through the political sphere, and the political sphere alone, these people believe, can one be happy. Throughout the world, in the name of progress, right, these progressives, men who call themselves communists, socialists, fascists, nationalists, progressives, and even liberals are unanimous in holding that government, with its instruments of coercion, must, by commanding the people how they shall live, direct the course of civilization and fix the shape of things to come. They believe in what Mr. Stuart Chase accurately describes as the overhead planning and control of economic activity. This is the dogma which all the prevailing dogmas presuppose. This is the mold in which are cast the thought and action of the epoch. No other approach to the regulation of human affairs is seriously considered or is even conceived of as possible. Right? We've lost that ability to think in terms of private action, something in the private sphere taking care of this, something in the cultural sphere, or religious sphere, or economic sphere, family sphere. All of these things have been subsumed by the political sphere. Politics is swamping everything. The recently enfranchised masses and the leaders of thought who supply their ideas are almost completely under the spell of this dogma. Only a handful here and there, groups without influence, isolated and disregarded thinkers, continue to challenge it. For the premises of authoritarian collectivism have become the working beliefs, the self-evident assumptions. No longer is it self-evidently true that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Instead, our new self-evident assumptions are that only authoritarian collectivism, that is totalitarianism, can move society in any effective way. The unquestioned axioms, not only of the revolutionary regimes, but of nearly every effort which lays claim to being enlightened, humane, and progressive. Right? This is the law of progressivism, this unbelievably bland use of the state to create a kind of tapioca conformity everywhere. So universal is the dominion of this dogma over the minds of contemporary men that no one is taken seriously as a statesman or a theorist who does not come forward with proposals to magnify the power of public officials and to extend and multiply their intervention in human affairs. Unless he is authoritarian and collectivist, he is a mossback, a reactionary, at best an amiable eccentric swimming hopelessly against the tide. It is a strong tide. Though despotism is no novelty in human affairs, it is probably true that at no time in 2,500 years has any Western government claimed for itself a jurisdiction over men's lives comparable with that which is officially attempted in the totalitarian states. No doubt there have been despotisms which were more cruel than those of Russia, Italy, and Germany. There have been none which are more inclusive. In these ancient centers of civilization, several hundred millions of persons live under what is theoretically the absolute dominion of the dogma that public officials are their masters and that only under official orders may they live, work, and seek their salvation. In other words, what is the modern state? Unlike what we might see in Romans 13 with the idea that God places these governmental powers over us, Lippmann is suggesting that there is no longer a separation between what is God and what is Caesar's, but instead that coin becomes one completely. And what do we find? That the modern state is behaving as a church. It has taken the place of the church. But it is even more significant that in other lands where men shrink from the ruthless policy of these regimes, it is commonly assumed that the movement of events must be of the same general direction: progress. Nearly everywhere the mark of a progressive is that he relies at last upon the increased power of officials to improve the condition of men. Though the progressives prefer to move gradually and with consideration by persuading majorities to consent, the only instrument of progress in which they have faith is the coercive agency of government. They can, it would seem, imagine no alternative, nor can they remember how much of what they cherish as progressive has come by emancipation from political dominion. They don't know their history. They don't understand it. By the limitation of power and by the release of personal energy from authority and collective coercion. For virtually all that now passes for progressivism in countries like England and the United States calls for the increasing ascendancy, godlike status of the state. Always the cry is for more officials and more power over more and more of the activities of men. Right? The average human being is having every aspect of his life, from the moment he wakes up until the moment he goes to bed, regulated not by all the various spheres into which we voluntarily agree to join and act, but instead coming from this one dominant political sphere, which is being run not only by the massive bureaucracy, but by the ideology that energizes it. Yet the assumptions of this whole movement are not so self-evident as they seem. They are, in fact, contrary to the assumptions bred in men by the whole lone struggle to extricate conscience, intellect, labor, and personality from the bondage of prerogative, privilege, monopoly, and authority. For more than 2,000 years, since Western men first began to think about the social order, the main preoccupation of political thinking has been to find a law which would be superior to arbitrary power. Right? And we saw that when we looked at someone like Means and his understanding of the eclipse of liberalism and what had happened. We have this ideal in the 18th century, this ideal of individual autonomy, the ideal that we have the right to life, liberty, and property, that these are our minimum rights, our basic rights. And from that, all things flow. Our ability to use our own talents and our own gifts, our ability to use them not just for ourselves, but for the good of the community. A community flourishes with talented people, especially when that talent is encouraged and leavened through the community. Men have sought it in custom, in the dictates of reason, in religious revelation, endeavoring always to set up some check upon the exercise of force. Right? This has been recent history. We do everything possible to limit the power of those in charge. You guys remember back to Western heritage. Think about the Magna Carta or Thomas Aquinas. Think about St. Augustine. All of these ideas and peoples who were doing everything possible to limit the power of those who wield it. This is the meaning of the long debate about natural law. This is the meaning of 1,000 years of struggle to bring the sovereign under a constitution, to establish for the individual and for voluntary associations of men rights which they can enforce against kings, barons, magnates, majorities, and mobs. This is the meaning of the struggle to separate the church from the state, to emancipate conscience, learning, the arts, education, and commerce from the inquisitor, the censor, the monopolist, the policeman, and the hangman. Conceivably, the lessons of this history no longer have meaning for us. Conceivably, there has come into the world during this generation some new element which makes it necessary for us to undo the work of emancipation, to retrace the steps men have taken to limit the power of rulers, which compels us to believe that the way of Enlightenment affairs is now to be found by the intensifying authority and enlarging of its scope. But the burden of proof is upon those who reject the ecumenical tradition of the Western world. It is for them to show that their cult of the providential state, capital P, capital S, is in truth the new revelation they think it is, and that it is not, as a few still believe, the gigantic heresy of an apostate generation. That's how far I would go. I would say that progressivism, by its very nature, is nothing but a gigantic heresy of an apostate generation. I think that Lippmann has put it extremely well, and that these people worship power, and that progressivism, by its very nature, can never, ever be humane. In one reason, because it must always have conflict between some groups and other groups. But for another reason, it inalterably believes that history is moving towards some end point, and if a person gets in the way, well, then that person be damned. We run right over them because they are in the way of progress. Now I'd like you to turn to page 779. And we're jumping forward here. We're getting into the 1950s, but I think this makes sense, even though we're out of time, a little bit out of chronological order here. But I want to look for a moment, and maybe more than a moment for the rest of our class today, at this document we have from Whittaker Chambers, and I'll give you just a little bit of background of who he was. Whittaker Chambers had been a spy for the Soviet Union, living in America. He was the editor of the magazine and the book editor, for Time magazine. He had held a very, very prominent position in America, and especially in America's public intellectual sphere. He had held a great position. But he had been a spy, and he had been passing his material on to a man named Alger Hiss, Hiss. So Chambers and Hiss had been spies together. Chambers would collect data, give it to Hiss. Hiss would get it to the KGB, to the NKVD, whatever the Soviet police was at that one moment. And the Soviets would then process it, of course, in a way to spy upon the United States. Now, the Soviet Union was briefly our ally during World War II. Never an official ally, but de facto an ally along with Britain. We were the big three, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. But at the end of World War II, in 1945, 46, 47, and 48, we realized that, and it was a slow realization, but we did realize, and we came to realize through a lot of pain and struggle, that the Soviet Union was indeed our enemy as much as Nazi Germany had been our enemy. We began to realize very quickly that Stalin was just as bad, if not worse, than Hitler. So it may have been just, maybe, to have allied with the Soviet Union to defeat the evil of Nazism. Certainly the defeat of Nazism was good. There's no question about that. The question would be, should we have allied with someone like the Soviet Union in our efforts against the Nazi regime? The Nazis, as I said, were horrible, but the communists were equally bad. And so when it comes out at the end of World War II that not only are the Soviets just as bad as the Nazis, but in fact we had very high government officials who were working with the communists, there was a fear of great betrayal in the American people, among the American people, and in the American government. And this is the beginning of the Cold War. We're going to talk a lot more about the Cold War later on, but I wanted to give you this background for what's going on with Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss he's a Harvard graduate, Ivy League all the way. He had been one of the main aides to Franklin Roosevelt during what was called the Yalta Conference, which was going to determine what the post-war world looked like. So the fact that Hiss was the one negotiating with Stalin means that for all intents and purposes, America had no real seat at Yalta because we were being represented by a Soviet spy. So the Soviets were really talking to themselves because they had Alger Hiss. So all of this comes out in terms of Whittaker Chambers admitting that he had been a communist, and he names names, he names Alger Hiss. And this was, as you might imagine, an incredible scandal in America. And this goes to trial in the House of Representatives in Congress. This is where Richard Nixon, a young representative from California, makes his reputation. But this hearing between Hiss and Chambers is put on by Congress. There is a trial, and it is one of the first televised things ever in the history of television. So this is riveting for Americans, getting their new TVs and now watching this thing. I bring up the TV thing for a lot of reasons. Number one, it mattered because this is going to be a big deal no matter what is the first thing televised. It's going to be a big deal. It happened to be the Chambers Hiss case. But the other reason it matters so much is because we can question just how much does our visual appearance matter to the way those on the other side of the screen perceive us. Whittaker Chambers was brilliant. Both men were. Hiss and Chambers were both brilliant in terms of just their raw intellect. But Chambers was, and I can't put this delicately, and I apologize, he was immensely fat. He sweated all the time. He was incredibly nervous and inarticulate. He could hardly get any words out. Now, if you put a typewriter in front of him, the guy could do anything and explain anything. But if you get him to speak, he can't speak at all. He's nervous, and he's constantly wiping his brow, and he's wiping his hands on his face, and he's mumbling, and there's spittle, and he's just not an attractive person by any means. And you think about him being on trial. This is not good for the anti-communist side because he's testifying against the communists. But Alger Hiss was Ivy League educated. He was the great fair-haired child, this young man who seemed to represent the best of America. And so he was very handsome, very articulate, very well-spoken, just the opposite of Whittaker Chambers. So in the way that the Americans perceived this, they could easily have allowed the first televised performance, the first televised conflict, to be judged by appearances. And we know that we have a hard time escaping that. There's a reason that most politicians today are reasonably good looking. So the Hiss Chambers case was riveting for Americans, and certainly allowed for the Americans to look into a side of communism they had not seen before. And so this piece that you have on page 779 is a very important piece because we have Chambers explaining not only why he had become a communist, but why he had left communism. So dated 1952, "My beloved children, I am sitting in the kitchen of the little house at Medford, our second farm, which is cut off by the ridge, and a quarter-mile across the fields from our home place where you are. I am writing a book. In it, I am speaking to you, but I am also speaking to the world. To both I owe an accounting. It is a terrible book. It is terrible in what it tells about men. If anything, it is more terrible in what it tells about the world in which you live. It is about what the world calls the Hiss Chambers case, or even more simply, the Hiss case. It is about a spy case. All the props of an espionage case are there. Foreign agents, household traitors, stolen documents, microfilm, furtive meetings, secret hideaways, phony names, and informer investigations, trials, official justice. But if the Hiss case were only this, it would not be worth my writing about or reading about. It would be another fat folder in the sad files of the police, another crime drama in which the props would be mistaken for the play. It would not be what alone gave it meaning, what the mass of men and women instinctively sensed it to be, often without quite knowing why. It would not want to be what, at the very beginning, I was moved to call a tragedy of history. For it was more than human tragedy, much more than Alger Hiss or Whittaker Chambers was on trial in the trial of Alger Hiss. Two faiths were on trial, for human societies, like human beings, live by faith and die when faith dies. At issue in the Hiss case was the question of whether this sick Western American society, which we call Western civilization, could in its extremity still cast up a man whose faith in it was so great that he would voluntarily abandon those things which men hold good, including life, to defend it. At issue was the question whether this man's faith could prevail against a man whose equal faith it was that the society is sick beyond saving, and that mercy itself pleads for its swift extinction and replacement by another. At issue was the question whether in the desperately divided society there still remained the will to recognize the issues in time to offset the immense rally of public power to distort and pervert the facts. At heart, the great case was this critical conflict of faiths, and that is why it was a great case. On a scale personal enough to be felt by all, but big enough to be symbolic, the two irreconcilable faiths of our time, communism and freedom, came to grips in the persons of two conscious and resolute men. So, once again, a vital understanding. What do we actually believe in? It's not enough coming out of World War II and into the Cold War knowing that we hate the Nazis and hate the communists. Those are good things. We should hate both and absolutely hate both of those ideologies. We should hate them. But what do we actually stand for? It's one thing to be anti-this and anti-that, but what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a member of Western civilization? And by 1952, when Chambers publishes this book in Witness, about half of the world lived under some form of communism, most of it being directed out of the Soviet Union, out of Moscow. So this is huge. What do we do when half the world is being controlled by a vicious, bloodthirsty ideology? We'll jump the page to 781 and look at the second to last full paragraph on that page. I will give you an answer. I was a witness. I do not mean a witness for the government or against Alger Hiss and the others, nor do I mean the short, squat, solitary figure trudging through the impersonal halls of public buildings to testify before congressional committees, grand juries, loyalty boards, courts of law. For a man is not primarily a witness against something. This is only incidental to the fact that he is a witness for something. A witness in the sense that I am using the word is a man whose life and faith are so completely one that when the challenge comes to step out and testify for the faith, he does so, disregarding all costs and accepting all consequences. So what is it? What is it that allows us to believe in something like communism? You here at Hillsdale, especially since you're in your second semester of the Heritage Corps, you know that we spent all of first semester looking at what we believed in. From the pre-Socratics all the way up to John Calvin, we tried to understand, what does the West stand for? What does it believe in? And certainly in the first part of this course, we looked at what was the American founding. What did America stand for? Not just what it was against, but what it stood for. So turn to page 783, the second to last paragraph there on 783. Few men are so dull that they do not know that the crisis exists and that it threatens their lives at every point. Remember, over half the world is controlled by communism. But we also in the West don't know who we are, and that's a crisis too. It is popular to call it a social crisis. It is in fact a total crisis. Religious, moral, intellectual, social, political, economic. It is popular to call it a crisis of the Western world. It is in fact a crisis of the whole world. Communism, which claims to be the solution to this crisis, is itself a symptom and an irritant of the crisis. In part, the crisis results from the impact of science and technology upon mankind. Think about the ideas of Darwin and this never-ending evolution, or the idea of huge corporations and huge entities controlling our lives, which neither socially nor morally has caught up with the problems posed by that impact. In part, it is caused by men's efforts to solve those problems. World wars are the military expression of the crisis. Worldwide depressions are its economic expression. Universal desperation in its spiritual climate. This is the climate of communism. Communism in our time can be no more considered apart from the crisis than a fever can be acted upon apart from the infected body. Turn the page. And here's where we see Chambers at his most shocking. I see in communism the focus of the concentrated evil of our time. All right, it makes sense. You will ask, remember this is a letter to his children, why then do men become communists? How did it happen that you, our gentle and loved father, were once a communist? Were you simply stupid? No, I was not stupid. Were you morally depraved? No, I was not morally depraved. Indeed, educated men become communists chiefly for moral reasons. Okay, that's where it gets complicated. We've just been told that communism is the focus of all evil in the modern world, but men become communist for moral reasons. So how can he reconcile that? Indeed, educated men become communists chiefly for moral reasons. Did you, Father, not know that the crimes and horrors of communism, the gulag, the mass killings, the imposed famines, are inherent in communism? Yes, I knew that fact. Then why did you become a communist? And this is the question we have to ask. Why did he become a communist? So look down to the bottom of that same page. The revolutionary heart of communism is not the theatrical appeal, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, you have a world to gain. This was a simple statement of Karl Marx, further simplified for handy use. Philosophers have explained the world. It is necessary to change the world. Communists are bound together by no secret oath. The tie that binds them across the frontiers of nations, across the barriers of language, and the differences of class and education in defiance of religion, morality, truth, law, honor, the weaknesses of the body, and the irresolutions of the mind, even unto death, is a simple conviction. It is necessary to change the world. Their power, whose nature baffles the rest of the world, because in a large measure the rest of the world has lost that power. What is it? It is the power to hold convictions and to act on them. It's not enough to be an American. You have to know why you're an American. What does it mean to be an American? It's not enough that you hate the commies and the Nazis. You should. You better. But what does that mean that we actually stand for? It is the same power that moves mountains. It also has the unfailing power to move men. Communists are that part of mankind which has recovered the power to live or die, to bear witness for its faith. And it is a simple, rational faith that inspires men to live or die by it. It is not new. It is, in fact, man's second oldest faith. Its promise was whispered in the first days of the creation under the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Ye shall be as gods. It is the great alternative faith of mankind. Like all great faiths, its force derives from a simple vision. Other ages have had great visions. They have always been different versions of the same vision. The vision of God and man's relationship to God. The communist vision is the vision of man without God. It is the vision of man's mind displacing God as the creative intelligence of the world. It is the vision of man's liberated mind by the sole force of rational intelligence, redirecting man's destiny and reorganizing man's life and the world. It is the vision of man once more the central figure of creation, not because God made man in his image, but because man's mind makes him the most intelligent of the animals. Copernicus and his successors displaced man as the central fact of the universe by proving that the earth was not the central star of the universe. Communism restores to his sovereignty by the simple method of denying God. Right? This is the power of communism. And from the standpoint of the communist, this is inexorable, it is inevitable, this movement towards a communist paradise. And only anti-communists stand in the way. And in a sense, because communism is creating heaven on earth, those anti-communists who stand in the way are, by all intents and purposes, they are traitors and heretics to the movement, and they should be removed. So we have to ask then, why would anyone leave this faith? So we want to ask, how are we going to find our faith in America and the Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman tradition? How will we find it and reclaim it? But we also have to ask then, why would any communist leave it? Obviously Chambers did, and lots of communists have left it. So why? Turn to page 789, and we get a beautiful passage here. Gut-wrenching, but beautiful. 789, Whittaker Chambers tries to explain why someone would leave. Yet there is one experience which most sincere ex-communists share, whether or not they go only part way to the end of the question it poses. The daughter of a former German diplomat in Moscow was trying to explain to me why her father, who as an enlightened modern man had become extremely pro-communist, had become an implacable anti-communist. It was hard for her because she, as an enlightened modern young woman, shared the communist vision without being a communist. She would have been called a pink, a socialist, not a red, a communist, but a pink. And she still would have been a progressive. And she probably believed we were moving towards communism, but she believed that we could do it peacefully and through the vote rather than through revolutionary exercise of violence. It was hard for her, Chambers continues, because as an enlightened modern girl, she shared the communist vision without being a communist. She loved her father, and the irrationality of his defection embarrassed her. He was immensely pro-Soviet, she said. And then, you will laugh at me, but you must not laugh at my father. And then, one night in Moscow, he heard screams. That's all. Simply one night, he heard screams. A child of reason and of the 20th century, this young woman knew that there is a logic of the mind, but she did not know that the soul has a logic that may be more compelling than the mind's. And she did not know at all that she had swept away the logic of the mind, the logic of history, the logic of politics, the myth of the 20th century with 5 annihilating words. One night he heard screams. What communist has not heard those screams? They come from husbands torn forever from their wives in midnight arrests. They come muffled from the execution cellars of the secret police, from the torture chambers, from all the citadels of terror now stretching from Berlin to Canton. They come from those freight cars loaded with men, women, and children, the enemies of the communist state, locked in, packed in, left on remote sightings to freeze to death at night in the Russian winter. They come from minds driven mad by the horrors of mass starvation, ordered and enforced as a policy of the communist state. They come from the starved skeletons worked to death or flogged to death as an example to others in the freezing filth of the subarctic labor camps. And they come from children whose parents are suddenly, inexplicably taken away from them, parents they will never see again. What communist has not heard those screams? Execution, says the Communist Code, is the highest measure of social protection. What man calls himself a communist who has not accepted the fact that terror is an instrument of policy, right if the vision is right, justified by history, and enjoined by the balance of forces in the social wars of this century. Those screams have reached every communist mind. Usually they stop there, in the mind. What judge willingly dwells upon the man the laws compel him to condemn to death, the law of nations or the law of history? But one day, the communist really hears those screams. He is going about his routine party tasks. He is lifting a dripping reel of microfilm from a developing tank. He is justifying to a communist fraction in a trade union an extremely unwelcome directive of the Central Committee. He is receiving from a trusted superior an order to go to another country and in a designated hotel at a designated hour meet a man whose name he will never know, but who will give him a package whose contents he will never learn. Suddenly there closes around that communist a separating silence, and in that silence he hears screams. He hears them for the first time, for they do not merely reach his mind, they pierce beyond, they pierce to his soul. And he says to himself, those are not the screams of man in agony. He hears them for the first time because a soul in extremity has communicated with another which that alone can hear it, another human soul. something the communists simply cannot understand. So Chambers is then asked, he had not heard these screams because he was working in an American bureau. He was working at Time magazine and passing along microfilm to the KGB through agents. So he had never been part of any kind of torture. He'd never seen it. He'd never heard it. And he was asked, well, why? Why did he lose his faith in communism? And notice that question of the soul speaking to the soul. Chambers tells two beautiful stories about this, and we'll end on this today. He says, number one, I was watching my little baby girl sitting in her high chair and eating porridge, oatmeal, and she kept meditatively looking at it and dropping it on the floor. And he should have been furious about that, because here she is making intentionally, even though a little girl, a mess. And he says, my eyes came to rest on the delicate convolutions of her ear. And I suddenly realized that is the only ear like that ear ever in the history of the world or in the history of existence. And he said, I knew at that moment that there was something unique to the human person that could never be explained by the rationality of communism. To his son, he said, I never understood why you listened obsessively to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but it was always the third movement, the terrible, the quiet movement, before the Ode to Joy, the fourth movement. Why would you listen to the dirge? Why that? And because his son said, very wise, because Dad, no one ever understands beauty until they understand sorrow. So there's this great moment at the very end of this document in which Chambers, of course, remember, he's writing a letter to his children in which he tries to explain to them what communism had done. And one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet is that Chambers suffered deeply from depression, and he had very strong suicidal tendencies. He did die, amazingly enough, of natural causes in 1962, but he was worried all the way up to that point that he would take his own life. And he didn't want to leave that legacy for himself or for his children, but this was an overpowering urge at times, and he believed that communism had done this to him. So these last pages, 794 and 795, are two of the most powerful pages I've read in the English language, and I want to just read his final statement here because it's just stunning. He says, Dear children, one autumn twilight, when you were much smaller, I slipped away from you in play and stood for a moment alone in the apple orchard near the barn. Then I heard your two voices, piping together anxiously, calling to me, Papa, Papa, from the harvested cornfield. In the years when I was away 5 days a week in New York, working to pay for the farm, I used to think of you both before I fell asleep at night. And that is how you almost always come to me, voices of beloved children calling to me from the gathered fields at dusk. You called to me once again at night in the same orchard. That was a good many years ago. A shadow deeper and more chilling than the autumn evening had closed upon us, and I mean the Hiss case. It was the first year of the case. We had been doing the evening milking together. For us, one of the few happy results of the case was that at last I could be home with you most of the time. In life, these good things usually come too little or too late. I was washing and disinfecting the cows and putting on and taking off the milkers. You were stripping after me. And in the quiet, there suddenly swept over my mind a clear realization of our true position. Obscure, all but friendless people, some of my many great friends had already taken refuge in aloofness, and others I had withdrawn from so as not to involve in my affairs. Against me was an almost solid lineup of the most powerful groups and men in the country. The bitterly hostile reaction of much of the press, the smiling skepticism of much of the public, the venomous calumnies of the Hiss forces, the all but universal failure to understand the real meaning of the case and my purpose. A sense of the enormous futility of my effort and my own inadequacy drowned me. I felt a physical cold settle through me, settle around my heart and freeze any pulse of hope. The sight of you children, guiltless and defenseless, was more than I could bear. I was alone against the world, and my longing was to be left completely alone, or not to be at all. It is that death of the will which communism with great cunning always tries to induce in its victims. I waited until the last cow was stripped and the last can lifted into the cooler, and then I stole into the upper barn and out into the apple orchard. It was a very dark night. The stars were large and cold. The cold was one with the coldness in myself. The lights of the barn, the lights of the house and the neighbors' houses were warm in the windows and on the ground, but they were not for me. Then I heard Ellen call me in the barn, and then John call, "Papa!" Still calling, Ellen went down to the house to see if I was there. I heard John opening gates as he went to the calf barn, and he called me there. With all my longing of my love for you, I wanted to answer. But if I answered, I must come back to the living world, and I could not do that. John began to call me in the cow stable, in the milk house. He went into the dark side of the barn. I heard him slide the door back into the upper barn, where at night he used to be afraid. He stepped outside of the dark, calling, "Papa, Papa!" Then frantically on the verge of tears, "Papa!" I walked over to him. I felt that I was making the most terrible surrender I should have to make on this earth. "Papa!" he cried and threw his arms around me. "Don't ever go away." "No," I said. "No, I won't ever go away." But both of us knew that the words "go away" stood for something else, and that I had just given him my promise not to kill myself. Later on, as you will see, I was tempted in my wretchedness to break that promise. My children, when you were little, we used sometimes to go for walks in our pine woods. In the open fields you would run along by yourselves, but you used instinctively to give me your hands as we entered those woods, where it was darker, lonelier, and in the stillness our voices sounded loud and frightening. In this book, I am again giving you my hands. I am leading you not through cool pine trees, but up and up a narrow defile between bare and steep rocks from which in shadow things uncoil and slither away. It will be dark, but in the end, if I have led you aright, you will make out 3 crosses, from 2 of which hang thieves. I will have brought you to Golgotha, the place of skulls. This is the meaning of the journey. Before you understand, I may not be there. My hands may have slipped from yours. It will not matter. For when you understand what you see, you will no longer be children. You will know that life is pain, and that each of us hangs always upon the cross of himself. And when you know that this is true of every man, woman, and child on earth, you will be wise. God bless everybody. Have a beautiful Holy Weekend, and may you share in the joy and the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ on Sunday morning.